Good afternoon. My name is John Lindahl. I'd like to welcome you to the Nebraska State Historical Society's Brown Bag Lecture Series, held here at the Museum of Nebraska History on the third Thursday of every month. A detailed schedule for this series, as well as information about all the Historical Society's programs and services, can be found on our website, which is nebraskahistory.org. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to thank the Nebraska State Historical Society Foundation for funding the filming of these lectures. Their financial support allows us to tape and broadcast these programs on public access television. Our speaker today is Bill Kelly, senior producer at NET Television. His topic is very timely, as he will discuss his documentary 68, The Year Nebraska Mattered, how the presidential campaign and events of 1968 shaped a generation of political leadership in Nebraska. Please welcome Bill Kelly.
John? Thank you very much, John, and thank you to the Historical Society for the invitation. I hope if any of you are here for Ken Burns, that's a little later this evening, so, but please stay put. I think you'll still find this interesting. This project, like a number of them that NET does and that I've been involved in, would simply not be possible without the help and the support of the Nebraska State Historical Society and especially a film archivist, Paul Eisloffel, who's with us here today. It's a fantastic resource that very few states have access to, and some of the clips we'll be seeing here today were pulled directly from the archives here. John mentioned that this was a timely documentary, which is kind of odd when you think in terms of something being timely that occurred 40 years ago. We didn't realize how timely it was going to be when we first started talking about it, although we had some inclinations. Because in the November election of 1968, Nebraska gave Richard Nixon the largest margin of victory of any state in the nation, which raises the question why so many Democrats look at that year as one of the party's finest hours in the state of Nebraska, and how so many people think back to that 1968 campaign as being very, very personal to them. It was about that time that it created truly an entire generation of political leadership in the state of Nebraska. Governor Kay Orr, Secretary of State Alan Bierman, his successor John Gale, Congressman John Y. McCollister, his son now running for the Public Service Commission, John S. McCollister, his opponent in that election, Ann Boyle, also worked in the 1968 campaign. It was her father who orchestrated Hubert Humphrey's campaign. Her husband, Mike Boyle, goes on to become from Deputy Election Commissioner in Douglas County to Mayor of Omaha, now on the Douglas County Commission. Former U.S. Attorney Tom Monahan, Congressman John Kavanaugh. Add to the list some political professionals like Mike Acuff and Steve Fowler, who would go on to run Bob Kerry's campaigns. And even 60s advocates, activists like Ernie Chambers, of course, while not involved directly in the campaigns at the time, certainly have continued to have an impact on state politics and are woven their way into the state's political fabric over the years. No one really realized it at the time, but the 1968 presidential primary would become the last time Nebraska truly had an impact on the race to the White House. This was a hothouse campaign. It was in full flower that year. It influenced so many people, not only because of their direct involvement in the campaigns, but just because there was so much tumult and so much turmoil in the country at a time, people couldn't help but be passionate about the issues. The documentary I produced for NET Television, 68, The Year Nebraska Mattered, tells the story of that year, of its policy, of its politics, and also the legacy it left behind. What I want to do today is take you back to remind you why this campaign was so significant. Talk a little bit about some of the parallels in 1968 to the campaign of 2008, and also a little bit about the footage and how this project came to be in the first place. The 68 primary provides really a unique window into this tumultuous year in American politics. It occurred just at the right time. That's a big part of why Nebraska mattered, was just dumb luck, frankly, as you'll see where the events unfolded. And after decades of dominance of an old guard, these very high presidential campaigns provided a stepping stone for a new generation of political leadership in the state and elsewhere in the nation also. 1968, as most of you may at least be familiar with, there was a very unpopular war. Race relations were a key issue. There had been a series of race riots around the country. Omaha had had its fair share as well. Demonstrations in the streets. Into this early on in 1968, and it's a great example of just how divisive and how raw people were at this time, George Wallace announces he's going to run for President of the United States as well. He had been a Democrat, a Southern Democrat previously, and was very much a populist candidate in his home state of Alabama. He was not governor at the time. His wife had become governor of the state of Alabama at that point. But he created his own party, the American Party, and in order to get on the ballot, he had to have his own convention and make sure that there was enough party support. So he rolls into Omaha in March of 1968 to the Civic Auditorium to gather his American Party loyal and to get enough signatures to get on the ballot in short order. What occurred was, many would argue, great for Wallace and disastrous for the city of Omaha. It was obviously a very controversial candidate. He was openly called a racist by not only the black community, but in some cases even members of his own party. He had a fiery rhetorical style, as we'll see in a little bit, and there was a real effort to among not only the black community, but also, interestingly, an awful lot of the socially active Catholic community to protest, not intentionally disrupt the convention, but at least let their views be known. They come down to the Civic Auditorium. There's still a little bit of debate as to whether this was a setup or not, but the demonstrators come down to the convention floor. There's no security stopping them. There's some speculation that this was actually all kind of staged by the Wallace folks, knowing that putting, quite literally, physically, the demonstrators between the delegates and the TV cameras and George Wallace would make great TV. By the time it was over, there were chairs flying through the air, there were fists being thrown, there were police macing some of the demonstrators, and it was a mess. And then it ended up spilling out into North Omaha. Let's take a look at a little bit of footage and a quick summary of that from the documentary.
That the governor wants. Governor Wallace wants to give the people of Nebraska a chance in November to vote for him, and that's the total aim.
What I want to know is how you're going to be sure that the people that are signing these registers, these rosters, are legal, registered voters, eligible to vote in this here up-and-coming election. They had to be registered over in the courthouse.
That's right.
We want freedom, stand
doing this because I'm convinced that this is what I need to do. Because we don't need the racists, we don't need the segregationists, we don't want such a thing as a president in the United States. We don't feel that he should prevent anybody else from getting the position that might get it otherwise. We feel he's a hindrance to the progress of our country, and we don't want such a person as president.
The melee that ends up unfolding down on the floor doesn't last an awful long time. Wallace does end up getting back up in front of his followers, and boy, they're fired up by then. He's being able to point out that the law and order issues that he has been touting and the race issues that he's been touting are unfolding literally right before their eyes. Let's give a listen to what Governor Wallace had to say.
Distraction a moment ago by the freedom of speech folks who believe in free speech to everybody but themselves. They don't mind a communist. They don't mind people speaking on college campuses advocating communist victory, but they don't want somebody like us to speak and assemble peacefully here tonight. But there are... We want to get on the ballot, and you made it possible to get on the ballot in this state. The person who knocks you in the head, he's out of jail before you get in the hospital, and on Monday morning they'll try the policeman about it. They get all right there. Just as much against the breakdown of law and order as those of us who assembled here tonight. This is not a matter of race. It's a matter of anarchists and revolutionaries who do not care about any institution in Nebraska or the United States.
It's really interesting that when you talk with people who were there at the time, how they feel very much that the Wallace campaign baited this into occurring. But the editorial in the World-Herald the very next day really blasted the demonstrators themselves. And it says, and this is a quote, "It was not the white racists who invited disorder. It was black racists and their white allies, including several nuns and members of the clergy." Just a few weeks later, after this, Reverend Martin Luther King was, I should add, Governor Wallace did end up getting enough signatures to get on the ballot, and he did end up running in Nebraska. Did not do especially well here or nationally, but again, it really kind of set the tone for just how ugly and divisive a lot of what was going on. As I mentioned, Omaha had some racial disturbances earlier, and just a few weeks later, Dr. Martin Luther King is assassinated, and Omaha was very, very concerned about that there were going to be disturbances, as there were across much of the rest of the country. I found this bit of eulogy from a community activist named Lawrence McVoy, something of a eulogy for Dr. Martin Luther King to be really interesting and very telling about the black community very much wanting to represent itself well in memory of Dr. King.
I am ready. We don't need a mob. You got me. I am ready to take on anybody who wants to start something now. Tell him, Mike. You see, Mr. Wilkins said, "Cool it, baby." See? Now, he is way up there in New York. But see, I'm standing here in front of you, and I know who you are. And I'm telling you personally, cool it, baby. We are outgunned, we are outmanned, we have been outsmarted, and we are surrounded. You understand? Now is the time for us to get smart, not mad. You see? Hearts are warm, and soft and ready to deal. We don't need to go and get killed because Brother Martin died already. You see, the parallel is there. You got the message. Go home, get smart, keep on fighting. We have got to win. The mayor said it's got to change. The mayor said it's got to change. You can't expect these ministers and teachers and leaders, both the anointed, the appointed, to work on the problems of bringing the black brother up to a level if you're going to get kicked in the teeth from out west.
Keep the lid on, as it were, after Dr. King's assassination. There would be another series of disturbances, most of them promoted by a feeling that the Omaha Police Department was unfairly targeting the black community, and there are still debates about that to this day, needless to say. The other thing that's going on in 1968 that maybe most people recall more is just what's going on in the counterculture with music and drug culture and the hippies out in San Francisco and the like. About the only hippie enclave in the state of Nebraska in 1968 was just beginning to stir down in Omaha's Old Market area. But it's pretty striking when you look at the footage of young Nebraskans in 1968. This was a pretty clean-cut bunch. And then it's like 3 or 4 years later when you start looking at some of the film footage that all of a sudden you start to see the little shaggier hair and long sideburns and the like. But Nebraska kids, for the most part, no one would certainly consider them hippies. By the same token, there was one of the film clips that I was most amused by was a school assembly, and it didn't identify which school it was, but it was a Catholic boys' school, and they brought in a young woman to as a cautionary note about getting involved in this hippie movement and the drug culture. And I'm not sure, but I think it may have backfired. But this was part of her presentation.
Because these people have a beautiful philosophy, but they got hung up on drugs on the way. Take it from me, I'm a hippie, man, and I'm just in disguise right now. But wow, just don't ever do it. I was in Golden Gate Park. You all have heard of Golden Gate Park in hippie land in Haight-Ashbury. Anyway, I dropped my acid and I was with some friends. And we all were sitting on Hippie Hill. You've all heard of that, I'm pretty sure, too. But we all were sitting there. And then all of a sudden, man, we were sitting there smoking grass, too, marijuana. And pretty soon we were all just stoned out of our minds. Here that are going to be going to Haight-Ashbury this summer. I can say that I don't want you to go to Haight-Ashbury, but really, way deep down inside, I'd love everybody to go and get turned on to what's happening. You see, they believe in love and peace. And because of this, they wanted to find the drug. They were told that through this drug, because of the newspapers and because of Leary and a few other people, that everybody got this misconception that, wow, I take this drug, I'm going to know everything.
We'd love to know, find out where this young woman, who she is, and where she ended up in life. She's probably like a vice president of a bank somewhere in America right now. So there's all this tumult going on in the presidential in the country, and all of a sudden there's a presidential election also, which actually had gotten started earlier late in 1967. There were already candidates beginning to line up. Eugene McCarthy on the Democratic side, senator from Minnesota, entered as an anti-war candidate. President Johnson is not doing an especially effective job. I think history will end up showing managing the Vietnam War, and it's becoming more and more a very unpopular cause. McCarthy's really the only candidate out there when the New Hampshire primary occurs, and does a lot better than anyone really expected, even with Johnson being as unpopular as he is. This was even with the governor of New Hampshire basically calling anyone who votes for McCarthy a traitor and a supporter of the North Vietnamese cause. Just a few weeks later, LBJ drops out. He stuns everybody at the end of a speech that he's giving and says, for the good of the country, I'm going to concentrate on ending the Vietnam War, which ironically would still drag on years after that, and pulls his name out of contention. Shortly after that, Robert Kennedy, the senator from New York, brother of John Kennedy, gets into the race, and it's like an electric shock goes through the political system. Really ticks off the McCarthy supporters because, you know, here's Clean Gene, who's been out there in the trenches all along, and all of a sudden Bobby Kennedy, who said he wasn't going to run, steps up to the plate. McCarthy doesn't do especially well in Indiana, and that sets up this sort of political perfect storm in Nebraska, which is the next big state. It's a conservative state, but it also had a good, strong campaign for John Kennedy in 1960. And so there are a lot of eyes who are very curious how Kennedy will do in a state where, you know, McCarthy's just up the road from Minnesota and the like. Time magazine gave a pretty good summary of what was going on at the time, and I'll quote here. In Nebraska, McCarthy's campaign machine is somewhat ramshackle. He's widely unknown among Nebraskans, and until this week has made only 4 appearances in the state. Bobby, by contrast, is almost too familiar in the Republican bastion that gave Nixon his largest margin against John Kennedy in 1960. Headed by Ted Sorensen's brother Philip, former Nebraska lieutenant governor, Kennedy's team last week was busily imitating McCarthy's tactics by dispatching scores of student volunteers to canvass 200,000 Democratic households. In contrast to that, interestingly, a McCarthy volunteer was the eventually to be Academy Award nominated actor John Beasley from Omaha. And he's quoted in a magazine as at the time as being a little grumpy about McCarthy's commitment to especially the black community in Omaha, and he points out that McCarthy's entire campaign budget for North Omaha is $25. So McCarthy was really struggling to try and keep his campaign together in Nebraska. Here comes Kennedy. He's got these huge crowds that are showing up everywhere. It's kind of remarkable to look at the footage at the time, and this may be one of the things that really people compare to what's going on right now, especially with Senator Obama and the level of excitement. Here's some film footage of Kennedy's WhistleStop tour across the state. Started all the way out in Scotts Bluff, traveled all the way to Omaha in a day, and the crowds were amazing.
Senator Robert Kennedy's special train rolled into Nebraska early this morning. The crowds, made up of young and old alike, remain spirited down the line.
I remember riding on the train with him across the state of Nebraska. I was Ethel Kennedy's bridge partner from Scotts Bluff to Grand Island.
Senator from New York and candidate for President of the United States.
Bobby Kennedy's WhistleStop tour along the Union Pacific line brought out Nebraskans like few other events in the state's history.
It was lively, it was upbeat. That's something Americans wanted at that time.
Well, I don't think that's acceptable, and I think we can do much better here in the United States.
Every town that they stopped in, the crowds would get larger and larger, and they were farther and farther behind as the train was coming across because they couldn't get these people off the tracks.
I know the importance of the state of Nebraska. I know the importance of your vote. But the fact is that we can do much better than we've done in the past, and I intend to do so if I'm elected President of the United States.
There is footage that we also have of Senator Kennedy's appearance in North Omaha just the day before the primary that's pretty remarkable as well, both for the lack of security, but also the size and enthusiasm of the crowd, where people are literally reaching out and rubbing his hair just to be able to get that little bit of contact. There was still so much of a connection in the black community with Robert Kennedy. The voter registration, that both the Kennedy campaign and the overall excitement about this campaign brought out voter registration in phenomenal numbers. 6,000 additional new voters in Douglas County alone, just in the few weeks heading into this primary. That would be a huge story even today. So then you already have McCarthy, you already have Bobby Kennedy in the race. Hubert Humphrey, vice president, at the very last minute, just a couple of weeks before the primary, also announces he's going to be getting into the race. He's not on the ballot, but it still becomes very much a factor. The Nebraska primary was what they call a beauty contest primary. You could vote for the candidate, and it would mean nothing. It was a popularity contest and nothing more. And it was just a sign that there were that many people that liked that candidate. What mattered were a whole separate set of ballots where you were electing the delegates to the national conventions. And because Johnson had dropped out, all of a sudden that meant, and dropped out after the registration deadline for the delegates, that meant you were getting a ballot where you were either voting for uncommitted or trying to figure out which of the Johnson delegates had gone to McCarthy or had gone to Kennedy or were up in the air. And so the idea is that Kennedy or McCarthy could win the popular vote, the beauty contest, and still it would mean nothing at the national convention if people weren't paying attention to who they were actually voting for. So there was this huge informational effort, big ads in the newspaper with, clip out and take this to the polls, saying that if you support Robert Kennedy or you support Eugene McCarthy, then you need to put your mark next to these specific names. There were 75 names on the ballot for people to choose from. And out of that, just a handful that you would end up selecting as the delegate to the national convention. One last note about these candidates, and this was very much a race of personality as well. In addition to the war, in addition to race relations, the personalities of these candidates really made an impression with folks, much like we see today as well. And you had McCarthy being the very cool, thoughtful, academic. I kept hearing the commentators last night referring to Obama as professorial. Well, McCarthy was the professorial candidate in 1968. Other people just said he was flat out boring as well. Kennedy was the charismatic, the very outgoing candidate, and so you almost have a merger of McCarthy and Kennedy and Obama if you're hearing the commentators talk. Then you have Hubert Humphrey, who's the classic old school stump politician. They called him the happy warrior, and really fast-paced, vigorous speeches. He was an old school liberal, and people loved coming out and hearing him talk as well. So there was a real choice in the type of men as well. I have some. If we have time, I have some additional clips of Kennedy's speeches that we'll play. But I want to bounce ahead a little bit to the Republican side. George Romney, the governor of Michigan, father of Mitt, was going to be running, ended up dropping out. He would have been the first Mormon presidential nominee had he stuck it out. It was an interesting candidate at the time. Nelson Rockefeller, back in a time when there were still liberal Republicans, Nelson Rockefeller fit the bill. Fiscal conservative, but still bucked the Republican establishment on a lot of economic and social issues. Very pro-union also, interestingly. And then Richard Nixon, who was pretty much the front runner from the start, having laid the groundwork for his political revival after getting beat for both the presidential race in 1960 and also attempting to become governor of California when you wouldn't have Dick Nixon to kick around anymore. And he worked and worked and worked very hard and found a new support within the public Republican leadership. He ran very strongly on ending the Vietnam War, was also the law and order candidate at the time, struck a nerve by addressing the disorder in the streets and the conflict among the races. He called the student protesters contemptible. He said I thought a very good quote is, "For the first time in 100 years, a presidential candidate can say there is no peace at home," and added that the first civil right of every American is protection against violence, literally turning the civil rights campaign in reverse as something that should almost be alarming. Nixon ran a great campaign in Nebraska, but there was one nagging exception, and that was, interestingly, Ronald Reagan. And it was kind of lost in history that the state of Nebraska provided Ronald Reagan with his very first ever test as a presidential campaign. The Nebraska primary was the first time he was on the ballot, and without setting foot in the state to campaign, doing it only with direct mail and with a set of basically infomercials, he ended up pulling in 20% of the vote. And that really got people's attention. There was almost a half-page article just devoted to Reagan's showing in Nebraska, and boy, we can't write this guy off after his showing in the Nebraska primary. A quick clip. Everybody noticed the Nixon on marijuana. Let's reveal the survey. He is not going to light up for you, I can tell you that. But the quote in response to a question about political assassination after Martin Luther King's assassination, I think kind of sets the tone for the disconnect of generations, and also says something about Nixon himself too.
If a man really wants to go out and assassinate somebody else, he can do it if he's willing to take the risks that are involved. I'm not concerned about it, to be fair. I think it's probably talk that goes on when perhaps they've had too much pot or whatever it is they take.
Okay, in case you missed that, it's just talk after they've taken too much pot. The misunderstanding of the counterculture and what was going on at that time, I think, is really evident time again, and and understandably, because it was just so completely different from anything else Americans had seen before. So the results of the election, as I said, Nixon ends up winning handily, even with the Reagan surprise. Robert Kennedy wins the popular vote, 51%, and every one of those delegates that was up for grabs, every one of them, the Kennedy people get. They did such a good job of organizing their campaign and letting people know who they had to vote for. So it was a huge victory for Kennedy. He ends up stumbling again in Oregon, loses to McCarthy, and then, of course, tragically in California, wins the California primary, only to be assassinated. And that's why we say that while the Nebraska primary didn't end up affecting nationally the course of events because because the Democrats were robbed of their likely nominee. But the impact that those events, that those candidates had on individuals led them to remain in the system. And by dislodging in that delegate ballot so many of the old guard Democrats, there was this huge flood of new blood, of new people into the state's Democratic Party, and that's where you see people like the Monahans and more women getting involved and more minorities getting involved. And after the Democratic Convention, the disastrous Democratic Convention, there was this whole move to open up the party delegate process. And so many of those people, even if they were sort of disenfranchised locally, if they were still kept on the fringes, their party nationally began to pull them into the process, and they found a power base. It was by the 1970s you began to see some of these faces showing up in the Nebraska state legislature. Ernie Chambers, John Kavanaugh, who's going to go on to become a congressman. It's almost a who's who of who's been involved in politics. Chris Beitler would come in shortly after that also. Don Wesley, a lot of those folks were just getting their political moorings. A couple of other quick notes, and then I'll take a couple of questions before we wrap it up. The film, as I mentioned, an awful lot came from the State Historical Society, but this project actually came about because a good friend, former colleague of mine, John Prescott, who's been out of journalism for a few years, called me up about a year ago and said, you know, I've got all this film in my basement. And what had happened was he had been an intern at Channel 3, KMTV up in Omaha, and the station was beginning to move to videotape and literally needed the space. And so they had all this film, especially the stuff that actually hadn't been on the air, what they call the outtakes. And they were throwing it all in the dumpster. And young Prescott stops his boss and says, some of that stuff's historic, shouldn't we keep it? And oh, kid, I got to get rid of it. He goes, well, golly, could I take some of it home? Sure, just get it out of here. And so there was about 5 hours of these outtakes that John Prescott kept in his basement for literally 40 years. And he said, you know, we're coming up on the anniversary of the '68 election. It's a presidential election year, and boy, it looks like it's going to be pretty exciting. Wouldn't this make an interesting program? And I have to admit, initially I said, I don't know. And then we started looking at this film. It's like, wow, some of this is really cool. And especially when you see the amount of excitement that was going on, it's visible in these. Plus, it's also a really nice reflection of how politics has changed over the years too. And I think that's of value as well. So part of my message, whenever I do one of these things, to the credit, hopefully in the assistance of our friends at the Historical Society, if you have stuff in your basement, or your neighbors have stuff in your basement, I'm not saying load it in the truck and dump it on their front doorstep, but before you throw stuff out, and especially if your kids aren't interested in some of these stuff, run it by somebody first and see if there isn't value in it. Because things like especially local campaign brochures and home movies of events that occurred and the like can be of such great value to historical researchers and guys like me to be able to tell stories like this. And sometimes you just don't even realize what you have. So don't go pitching it out just because you haven't got the room. Give it some thought before you send it out. And another plug, we also have what I think is a really nice website with this project as well. netnebraska.org/68, number 6, number 8. Not only are a lot of these film clips, but a lot of others on there. But there's also a place for people to share some of their recollections of 1968 and these political campaigns and what else is going on in the world. We love seeing that stuff on there. And we really think it's of value to share it for the next generation as well. So do you folks have any questions as well? If not, we'll wrap it up, and thank you so much for coming out. The program is still going to be seen on NET for through the election, and I think it'll probably be dusted off every now and then as well. And, of course, is available for sale online, too. But thank you so much for coming out and showing interest, and I'll be hanging around a little bit if you do have any other questions. Thank you so much.